Today we're talking all things menopause and exercise training. Hello there, my friends. Welcome back to my YouTube channel / the Messy Middle podcast. And today I want to dive in on a topic that is a hot topic everywhere, filled with misinformation, confusion, all of the things, and honestly, a lot of frustration because of that. And that is exercise training around menopause and during the menopause transition. And so my giant disclaimer here for self-preservation is that I know that this period of time and the changes and the shifts that come with it can feel really frustrating for you. And I'm going to ask you politely in my audience to not take it out on me as your human punching bag here if the advice or guidance I give you doesn't feel like it perfectly addresses your individual circumstance or feel like the exact solution that you need. But know that I am on your side and I'm doing this today to help you. I am friend, not foe. So what I want to dive into first is kind of the changes that we do see with the menopause transition, and then the types of approaches of training that I like to suggest for individuals during this period of time where exercise training is versus isn't so different from what you might be doing, normally, and what we actually need to consider within this. So first, let's talk about the menopause transition. So the menopause transition is essentially a phase of your life where you go through perimenopause, which is the period of time between being premenopausal, having a normal, regular menstrual cycle, and the state of being postmenopausal or being 12 months past your last menstrual cycle. And so these are really easy phases to denote. You're having a normal, regular menstrual cycle, you're premenopausal, you're no longer having a menstrual cycle, you're postmenopausal. But that transition in between there is when things start to get really wonky and haywire and your hormones kind of do this like craziness up and down all the time. And if you're going through that phase of life, I'm sure you can attest to that. And have had that experience of like this wonkiness and shifting and ever changing of your hormones as your body kind of goes through this phase where they're kind of haphazard and then they start to bottom out. And essentially you have this decline specifically in estrogen, which is that primary female sex hormone that we have that's doing a lot of awesome, amazing, positive things when it comes to regulating body composition, fat oxidation, muscle recovery, adaptation, all that in that premenopausal state. But then we have this decline or loss in that function going through this. Now there's other hormones doing a lot of different things during that time, but I want to focus mostly on that because that's one of the primary culprits of what a lot of the changes that we're seeing that occur during this phase of life. And so once you are in that peri to postmenopausal period, they aren't necessarily the same, but they do get lumped together. And so today, we're going to kind of talk about guidance that kind of is overarching for both of these, but recognizing that in that peri period, there's a lot of the more aggressive symptoms, maybe a lot more difficult time period for you, especially with exercise training, recovery, body composition changes versus when it finally kind of gets to the point that you're done with that menopause transition, things might start to feel a little bit better for you. And so my disclaimer here is that if you're dealing with significant menopausal symptoms and or having a really terrible time or difficult time with that transition or even post, please go advocate for yourself with your doctor, your OB, whomever you need to work with to make sure that you're getting the health and care that you need. I can't give out medical advice individually if you contact me after this podcast or in general, and I want to encourage you to advocate for that on your own, aside from the exercise information I'm giving here today. So with that being said, that is kind of the hormonal transition that we're seeing with that. And so what occurs when that is going on? So the first one is the one that I think all of you probably who have gone through this or are going through this will speak to, and it is changes in body composition. So the first thing that happens is that you have this shifting of body fatness to your abdomen or central body fat storage. And so you actually end up storing fat more like men in the postmenopausal or menopausal transition. So we start storing more fat around our organs here. That's called visceral adipose tissue. And then even our abdomen in general or subcutaneous adipose tissue. And for many of you, what you're feeling most frustrated with is that subcutaneous adipose tissue. So that outer bit of your belly, feeling like people call it the menopause or the menopause belly, all those things, because you have this shifting of your fat storage from your hips and your thighs like you did when you were premenopausal to your central abdomen. And so there is that subcutaneous fat that is more on the outside, the more of what you're seeing, the more of what you're feeling frustrated with. And that isn't as much of what we're worried about as it is in the increase in visceral adipose tissue. So visceral adipose tissue is the fat tissue that is stored around your organs inside your deep fat tissue inside your abdomen. And this is related with more inflammation and or more negative outcomes because of this and its proximity to your organs such as your liver and or basically just being fat wrapped around the inside of your organs part of your body rather than being kind of surface level underneath your skin. And so we don't want an increase in this or we want to reduce this if possible, but we do see a shifting of this with the menopause transition. And so that is more of the issue personally that I see rather than necessarily just your aesthetics and your body composition changing in a way that is unfavorable. That does not mean that you can't feel that way, but it is also a normal response to see that shift. It just comes because your hormones are shifting. And the average woman reports a 5 to 10 kilogram weight gain through that menopause transition. That's kind of the standard average reporting of what we see there. So it's important to state that even if it's frustrating or you potentially could recomposition your body or reduce body weight, it is still a normal physiological response to that, even if it isn't the ideal or desired one. So recognizing that, I know people don't like that answer, but that is just part of what comes with it. And so we have this change in fat storage and type of fat that we're storing in our body. And with this decline and loss of estrogen, we also have potentially loss of muscle tissue or a decline in our current muscle tissue mass and a decline in our muscle tissue function, as well as contractility, which basically is a fancy way of saying your muscle's ability to perform power and or function is less efficient, so you're not as powerful, or potentially that can impact independence or your ability to do things and maintain functionality as we continue to age further and further. But also that decline in muscle mass contributes to that, as well as can potentially negatively contribute to impacts in our metabolism. Muscle is a really important metabolic organ, and it's important for a lot of metabolic function, but also strength and physical output as we age. And the biggest culprit that we see here is potentially a loss of our functionality of a muscle fiber known as our type 2 muscle fibers. So we have type 1 muscle fibers that are more endurance based. They don't produce a lot of power, but they don't fatigue very easily. Think about long, slow, steady state running or endurance. And then we have these type 2 muscle fibers that are really powerful, and they are more of our power, heavy lifting, jumping, sprinting, burst, full muscle fibers that contribute to that in our exercise training or just even our day-to-day life. And so this is compounded by the fact that when we age, we also see loss and declines in the muscle in the same way. So menopause and aging happen concurrently and simultaneously, and it's hard to tease apart what is coming from age versus what is coming from shifts in hormones, but they do tend to happen simultaneously. So we want to make sure that we're really taking care of our muscle during this phase and transition of our life. And so we also are going to see potentially shifts and changes in our metabolic health and metabolism as well. And so because we have this loss of estrogen, when you are in the premenopausal state, you have a lot of estrogen in your body. We're typically a little bit better at fat oxidizing. We're storing the fat in our lower bits of our body. We're maybe a little bit more metabolically protective because of this. And so in the premenopausal state, we see lower rates of metabolic disease or cardiovascular disease in females compared to that of males. But then after or during that menopause transition, we see the opposite. We see higher rates of metabolic disease in this population with the onset of menopause. So we want to make sure that we are really protecting our metabolic health as much as we can because it is potentially impacted by this transition. So we see things like reduced insulin sensitivity or increased prevalence of basically type 2 diabetes, metabolic disease. We're not as good at using and storing glucose, as well as fats and or lipids in our blood, which can lead to cardiovascular disease. So we see shifts in the efficiency of being able to be more metabolically healthy or as metabolically protective. So we see an increase in metabolic and cardiovascular disease because of this. And this can also be, again, impacted by the shifts in loss in muscle, because muscle is a very metabolically protective organ. And so you can see a lot of these things are related. So we also have this reduced metabolic efficiency, potentially loss of muscle mass, increased fat gain, but that also then, we're gaining fat in a more inflammatory way, and that itself can all make us less metabolically efficient, less likely to, lose weight or make it harder to lose weight or increase weight gain. And it's all kind of this forward feeding kind of messiness that we see here within this. And then the last thing we see in regards to specifically exercise training is that you might have reduced recoverability or ability to recover between high, hard, or intense bouts of exercise training because of the shifts of these hormones here with this. And so those are the main things that are mostly associated with exercise training, performance, or body composition that people often tie in with exercise training and performance. And aside from this podcast here today, there might be shifts in Sleep quality and quantity, you definitely want to be focusing on improving and preserving that. You need to make sure you're dialing in your nutrition. You need to, again, you have less room for error in this period of time is how I like to think about it. So you need to, kind of reduce your margins of that, keeping protein intake high, managing overall caloric expenditure. Whether or not we burn less calories due to the menopause transition is still very much so up in the air. If we do, it might be very small, less than 100 calories a day, but unfortunate reality of human metabolism is that can actually add up a lot over time. So it's hard to say exactly what is causing the shift, but I think that the component of maintaining exercise training to a meaningful degree with moderate to higher protein intake, supporting your sleep, and then taking the training advice I hear today will help make you more resilient. For most people, and of course, again, my disclaimer is that this might not work for everyone because everyone's response might be more exaggerated or more different or just more difficult. And that's okay. And that's something that you should advocate outside of this podcast with a medical provider. So with that being said, protecting and preserving sleep quality as best as you can, maintaining a moderate to high protein intake diet quality, as well as just kind of being more tightly regulated with your intake. You might have less room for error there. Is kind of my side note disclaimer before we kind of dive into exercise guidance, training, and prescription. And so when I think about training for menopause, I think about these three main buckets that we really want to be hitting or thinking about with our training. And so that's heavy, hard resistance training focused at developing quality muscle tissue and or strength. Plyometric or power-based training designed for jumping, power, and or repeated force production in our training. And then high intensity cardio-based training. And that does not mean that low intensity isn't important for that as well, but we want high intensity quality-based training and then a high level of cardiovascular fitness or high levels of general physical daily activity mixed in with that as well. So we'll start with the strength training. So there's a lot of stuff out there for menopause of just lift heavy, just go hard, whatever. But what does that actually mean? So when you are in this phase of life, that's not that much different guidance than the other phases of life before that, or for males or for anyone else. Heavy and hard resistance training is lifting weights to a effort of at least 7 to 8, up to 9 out of 10, getting within 1 to 4 reps of failure and or having your reps slow down, or you get close to but not all the way to failure when performing an exercise set of training. And so I recommend you go watch my video on how to pick a weight in the gym, and then are you lifting heavy enough? I think those will be really helpful and informative of helping you figure out what that actually looks like and means for you. So you want heavy resistance training. Ideally, we want some heavy compound movements, specifically squat and hinging patterns that are targeting our hips and our spines, because one of the other things that happens with the menopause transition that I did forget to mention earlier was this loss in bone density or decline in our bone mineral density that can lead to osteoporosis or fractures or low bone density as we continue to age. But one of the best things that we can do to help preserve this or maintain this or even potentially gain it is to do heavy loaded resistance training. So putting load on our bone, and it needs to be an adequate enough load. So yes, you are technically putting load on your bone when you're running or you're walking, but it's not enough of a load for what we actually need to have this adaptation and response to the bone specifically that leads to improved or maintained bone density. So we do want some high and heavy training, hard and heavy training. And so the reason I say loading the spine and the hips is these are the two areas that we see some of the greatest bone loss and or fracture risk in this population. And if you get a DEXA scan and you are pre or menopausal or worried about this, they are going to they're not going to just give you a full body scan. They're most likely going to give you a hip and spine scan as well if you're getting a DEXA to assess this and look at the density of those specific areas within that. So that's why I really like heavy deadlifts or hinging type patterns. It doesn't have to be a barbell deadlift if you don't want it to be. It can be a trap bar deadlift, a Romanian deadlift, heavy machine based stuff. But we want to think about like picking stuff up off the floor or hinging at our hips or loading in a squat based pattern. So something like a squat, a leg press, a step up, a lunge, a split squat, anything at that knee type bending pattern. I really like thinking about these heavy compounds in this population to, of course, whatever you're comfortable with. You can start with body weight or just bands if you want to use machines, but working up to harder, heavier weights, whether that's machines, dumbbells, kettlebells, or barbells over time is something I really do suggest if that's something that you're open to or willing to do. And so that's why I encourage that specifically for the hips and in the spine. And that's where I like those hinging and the squatting. But for the rest of it, you really can, for training your upper body as well, you can use and get away a lot more with dumbbells or bands or kettlebells or machines, simply because you don't need as much load to stimulate the upper body, simply because it's just weaker than the lower body in this population. So if I'm going to encourage you to do anything of a heavy compound, I'm going to encourage it to be a squatting and a hinging pattern. But of course, you can use barbells or heavy machines or any sort of things like that for developing the upper body as well. If anything, I encourage you to maintain upper body strength and independence as well as we age. But when we're thinking about bone loss and muscle loss, I really do think it's important to make sure we're loading that lower half of our body specifically. But of course, doing pressing away from the chest, pressing overhead, pulling towards the body, and general core work as well as part of a well-rounded strength program is going to be really important here. And often it's how many days per week, what should I do, how much should I do? And I generally recommend most people start with at least 2 full body days per week, picking an exercise that kind of falls into each of those buckets of those movement patterns that I just listed out here. And then from there, picking those exercises and doing 2 to 3 sets. For heavy compound movements, I really like 3 to 6 reps, a little bit more strength, a little bit more heavy, a little bit more intense, but less reps. And then for everything else, you can kind of train across that hypertrophy spectrum of somewhere between that 6 to 15 reps is pretty good. Again, taking it into a few reps shy of failure, keeping your intensity up. And then if you aren't training with super heavy weights, you're training at home, or you're training with just bands or body weight, potentially going up to 30 reps, but making sure you're coming within that same range of failure. And again, check out my videos on YouTube on how to pick your weight of training. And I also have a video on how to adapt training for at home to make the most out of it. So you can kind of meet yourself where you're at within that. But that's my general recommendation of like what heavy lifting means and what that looks like. And so something else that you can add into these days of training is going to be plyometric or power-based training or jumping-based training. So plyometrics as well are a great way to load, again, our bones in a way that they adapt to improve or maintain bone mineral density. And so because they are a high repetitive impact, they put a lot of strain on our muscles, which pull on our bones, similar to lifting. We have this bone response that allows us to adapt to that to make our bones more resilient. And so plyometrics, there's actually quite a few studies done on peri and postmenopausal women with plyometrics. And often they're done with just like little bouts of jumping, like double leg hopping or skipping type stuff, a few times across the week, and if like maybe somewhere as low as like 10 reps for 2 to 3 sets per day, a couple days a week, 3, 4, 5 days a week. And it actually shows improvement in bones or preservation in that over time. So it doesn't need to be like, okay, you're going to the gym tomorrow and you're jumping into the most advanced athletic plyometric program out there. If anything, I wouldn't advise you to do that. Start with low level plyometrics, low level hopping and jumping, skipping type stuff, and then work your way up to that if you are able to adapt and improve over time. And then if you do have a little bit more of an athletic history as you're going through this, you can have more of those moderate to higher intensity jumping type drills, or keeping those in your program, or using them as a way to preserve some of your athleticism if you do have more specific training goals related to performance that you want to maintain during this phase and transition of your life. So adding in maybe 2 to 4 rounds of 5 to 10 hops to start, and then working your way up to the beginning of your lifts. Do them at the beginning, and you can start with just like 2 double leg pogo hops, and then you can work over time to something like a low box, or just a little bit of a plate or a riser in your gym, and doing hops up like that. And then over time you can work to single leg hops, or jumping higher, or getting more powerful within that. But make sure you start slow and low and do less than you think, and build up over time. People can really overdo it. You don't need a ton of this to get started. Start with less and go for more. So start with maybe 1 or 2 days a week of just 2 sets of this, and then let yourself adapt for 4 to 6 weeks and start to gradually add more in over time. And then as you adapt to that, you can go to single leg, jump higher, and then if you feel like you're ready to graduate to things like skater hops or single leg hops, or more technical, more athletic-y plyometrics, and you could do that from there, and maybe working with a coach or following a program like what we offer with the LIST method, if that's something that you're looking to add in or do as you just gain more overall strength development, skill development, as well as just being exposed to plyometrics and having the adaptations to that, jumping and the elasticity that comes with that, as well as in your training to progress with over time. So adding that in a few days a week, plyometrics are a good thing. And then last but not least is intensity in your cardio training. Now, there's a lot of I think more confusion around cardio training and menopause than anything else. And so, yes, exercise intensity and HIIT in sprint interval training is good, and it is good in this population. We do have studies that show that can help preserve muscle mass as well as muscle power output, as well as can improve body composition in this population specifically. So HIIT has been researched quite a bit in menopause, which I think is why so many people recommend that with the heavy strength training, especially with the changes in muscle characteristics that we are seeing. So it is a great opportunity to help kind of maintain some of that muscle and power output, especially in populations if you aren't willing to or are unable to do any sort of resistance training. Doing some sort of all out HIIT or sprint training might be a great way to at least maintain some of the integrity and quality of your muscle tissue and or power output or muscle mass in this population. And then of course there's some studies looking at that, of course, pair with protein or amino acids to really help with that. So making sure we're pairing this with our diet as well. And or studies that have shown that it does lead to slightly improvements in body composition. And then some studies suggest that it's maybe not that different than moderate intensity or continuous exercise training, but it does seem to have a positive benefit in that category as well. And so I think that there's this idea that, that you need to be doing a bunch of HIIT every single week. And then also that is counter to this suggestion that you might have lower exercise recovery training, lower recovery to exercise training in this phase or period of life as well. And so we need to balance those two things, especially if you were sedentary or you're new to exercise training in response to that training stimulus. You want to make sure you're meeting yourself where you're at. So if you're a pretty sedentary individual, you haven't done any HIIT training or a lot of cardio training, and you're going into this phase of life and you're like, I want to add this in, you might want to just start with some easier, slower intensity, more moderate intensity exercise training to build up your cardio fitness and your capacity, and then build towards intensity within. If you have some history of exercise training, you've been doing cardio in the past, you might want to prioritize 1 to 2 more quality sessions per week of sprint interval or high intensity interval type training, and then having the rest of your training across the week be lower intensity or more recoverable exercise activities that you enjoy doing that aren't specific, like cardio specific training days. So maybe you're doing 2 HIIT quality sessions per week, and then you're going on like a long hike on the weekends, or you're doing a lot of power walking throughout the week and you are elevating your heart rate, even if it's not a run necessarily, or doing a zone 2 session on a bike. And so we do want to maintain some of that HIIT and HIIT quality there in this population because of these reasons. But that doesn't mean that everyone's going to tolerate 3 or 4 days a week of HIIT, and you don't need to be doing these 30 to 60 minute long sessions. Often sprint or HIIT interval training can be 10 to 30 minute bouts of training, even 10 to 20, depending on what you're looking at doing. And the idea is that you're trying to do repetitive, all-out, forceful bouts of cardiovascular training, ideally on something like an air bike is really great, really accessible, really easy way to do this. If you have access to that, a stationary bike, you can do sprinting or treadmill running or regular running, but I would advise people to at least have some experience running in the past before you just dive into run sprint training. Rowers, ski ergs, so there's a lot of different ways that we can do this that are accessible out there. And so when we're thinking about true HIIT or sprint interval training, we're thinking about a little bit more of all out bouts of training. So like 20 to 30-ish seconds, maybe 10 to 30 seconds for sprint training, and then a full like minute to minute and a half, 2 minutes recovery, depending on how much you need between those. So you're going all out during those sprints, or HIIT interval sessions that are a little bit longer in duration. So maybe somewhere between that 60, 90, 2 minutes, upwards of 3 to 4 minutes for longer bout HIIT sessions. Again, the intensity will become slightly less from that HIIT to sprint spectrum, because the longer you go, the less high output you'll be able to maintain, but you're still going to be doing as hard as you can maintain for that individual bout of activity. So a 10-second all-out sprint is going to be a lot more intense and a lot more powerful and a lot more hard, but it will be shorter, versus a 4-minute interval bout of HIIT is going to be a little bit longer in duration, but you're going to maintain your highest and hardest intensity across that. So if you want specific HIIT protocols to follow, or more help on what actually is like a good HIIT protocol or setting up your week of cardio training, I'm going to shamelessly plug my ebook, Zones, below, and that will show you exactly how to set this up, what to do, how to perform it, different types of protocols that you can follow, rest intervals, all this stuff. A lot of these are just protocols that I've either pulled from the literature or just fun ways to get in cardio that are using work and rest intervals within those. And you could pick like one of those to start each week and then move up to 2 over time. But you really want to think about these work to rest ratios that are short all out bouts with like a rest recovery to being 2 to 3 times the length of that, all the way to these longer bouts of HIIT training where rest is like 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 to the training. So you might do 1 minute all out, 1 minute recovery for 10 bouts. That's another protocol that I really like. For sprint interval, you might start with 4 to 6 rounds of those short all out sprints with the longer rest periods. And then some of those longer ones that are 3-4 minutes long, you might do start with 2 rounds and work your way up to 3 to 4 of those over time with rest equal to that over time. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can kind of manipulate and configure HIIT training. But the general consensus is, or gist, I should say, not consensus, because there really isn't a consensus, is thinking about short all out intensity or one single bout of high intensity work and then fully recovering before repeating it again. And so I think it's also okay to mix in modalities here, like some CrossFit type training, high intensity functional training, I think can also serve this purpose here too. Having a cardiovascular bout mixed with some sort of muscular exhausting bout, I think that those are also perfectly fine to use in place of these as well in this population. The idea is that we're doing some sort of endurance-based muscle straining, high intensity activity that's repetitive but recovered in between these types of things. And if you are looking for a program that helps you do all these things, again, the List Method has on-demand cardio that does have specific HIIT and sprint interval training as well programmed for you within the app that you can kind of use each month or each week to kind of do this for you without you having to think about programming it yourself. And so the next thing we'll talk about is easy cardio, because that gets a bad rap because we're being told that doing easy cardio is spiking our cortisol and that's making us fat, so we shouldn't do it. And that's just silly goose nonsense. So one, visceral adipose tissue is decreased through cardiovascular training, especially when we do cardiovascular training that's lower in intensity. We're able to do it at higher volumes and more of it, and that will help reduce some of that visceral adipose tissue storage. Exercise decreases visceral adipose tissue. It doesn't necessarily make it worse. Usually that's coming from lifestyle or diet or poor behaviors. And if it is increasing anything, it's not, our cortisol isn't spiking and then making us store belly fat and making us fat. Cardio training, exercise training does not make you fat. But a mix match of high intensity training and recoverable training and what you can recover from can increase overall stress on your body. And that is what we want to make sure we're balancing. But if you are managing what you can recover from each week, eating enough, sleeping enough, recovering enough between those things, it's not making you fat, and that's silly. And so there is time and place for zone 2 training or easier exercise or moderate to easy cardio training in this population as well. We really want to think about increasing our fitness status as much as we can because of the risks that we see associated with metabolic disease and cardiovascular disease. And those also decline with this transition. So we want to preserve cardiovascular fitness as much as we want to preserve muscular fitness. And so cardio training with the high intensity is a great way to also maintain and preserve VO2, but we want that like larger volume, easier stuff as well, or general physical daily activity to keep our general overall cardio or just day-to-day fitness and activity levels high. Because one of the things we also see with the menopause transition is potentially decreases in spontaneous physical activity. So you might just move or walk or exercise or be less active and not really realizing it. So we want to try to keep up our general daily activity as much as we possibly can as we're going through this time period. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's silly to shy people away from any sorts of activities, but we just want to make sure that we can balance and recover the two. And also we need to acknowledge that there's people going through menopause or the perimenopausal time period who are endurance athletes or have endurance-based goals or specific outcomes that they're looking at, and you will still need to do generalized endurance training to work towards that. The biggest difference is in this niche and population is that once say you have a cardio base, you're trained, you're adapted, you're not totally new where everything is just such a novel stimulus that it's already hard itself for you. You might shift the percentage of your overall training up a little bit to include a little bit more intensity, or decrease the volume across the board to make more space for recovery so that you can maintain the quality of your sessions and the output and speeds and intensities you're trying to get. Especially, I think I see this a lot in my audience with runners or triathletes. They're like, I feel like I'm getting slower. And so you just want to make sure that you're maintaining intensity, speed, and quality work, maybe shifting up how much you do of that just a tad. And if you're having a harder time recovering, maybe spacing out high and hard intense days with a rest day, or spreading them out more across your week, which is something I typically recommend a lot, which is generalized hybrid training or training in general, is balancing that hard versus easy across the week so that you can kind of make space for recovery within your training, even independent of rest days, or putting rest days strategically in places where it can allow you to recover between harder chunks of days in a row of harder training sessions and cycles. And you might need that if you have more specific athletic goals, or you're finding you have a harder time recovering. So maybe you aren't doing, your high quality or HIIT sessions Tuesday and Wednesday back to back. Maybe they're Tuesday and Saturday, and then you have an easier day after the Tuesday day and a rest day, or a rest and an easy day, and kind of balancing that across the week based on your own recoverability. And or say, you were doing 20% of your training at a high intensity before you went through this period of life. Maybe you're shifting that to 30 to 35% of your training so you can maintain a little bit more of that quality, because you're losing that within that transition. And so those are the big main things that I think are really important for menopause, going through this transition of life when we're thinking about exercise training. And you will notice that there's no magical menopause exercise training protocol. It's really the things that we know work in good exercise training programs: heavy, strong lifting progressively, keeping quality, not just doing a bunch of junk volume, doing athletic stuff, being generally physically prepared, jumping, being powerful, and then doing well-programmed cardiovascular activity that balances intensity and easy stuff to recover and make sure that we can get enough in that allows us to reach our goals, or enough for health long-term so that we're actually adapting in our fitness training programs, and it benefits us not just in the short term, but also the long term as well. So the biggest thing when it comes to this period of time is that with the loss of hormones, you are potentially going to have a slightly harder time gaining muscle or gaining fitness or recovering or adapting to these things. But that doesn't mean that you won't at all. If you are newer to this, it will be a lot harder at first. And then if you have been an experienced exerciser your whole life and you are having a hard time with this, it might feel really foreign to you to be in your body as you're dealing with these things. And I encourage you to give yourself grace and recognize that just some stuff might need to shift compared to how you did it before. You might need to make more space for recovery or intensity or balancing that, which can be hard itself, right? That's hard to say, intensity might be too hard for you, but you also need that, but also you need to recover. And it's all about kind of striking that balance and what that looks like for you. I know a lot of people feel like they have to do 3 HIIT sessions a week because that's common advice out there, and that's not necessarily true. But you want to just make sure that you're maintaining quality, and the rest you can recover from. And those are the big things within your gym-based programs. And then outside of the gym, doing things to keep you physically active in whatever ways you enjoy. So if you like yoga and Pilates and walking and hiking or paddleboarding or kayaking, or whatever that looks like for you, being as active as you can in general across your lifespan, whether, you're going through menopause or just generally aging itself, is really, really important. Because what most people do is that they kind of stop moving and they stop exercising, and they stop training, and these things do become harder, or they get to the menopause period and they go, crap, I haven't been doing any of this stuff. Where do I even start, and what do I even do? And so that's where I encourage you to just start. And so if you were going to just dive into exercise training programs tomorrow, you've never trained before, you don't know what the heck to do, even this feels overwhelming and confusing for you, what I encourage you to do is start with 1 to 2 full body exercise sessions of resistance training per week, even if that's in your living room with your body weight, or going to a gym and following their preset circuit that they have laid out that hits the full body. Start there, do 2 sets, do somewhere between 6 to 10 reps is a good place to start if you're doing a machine there. If you're at home, maybe 10 to 15 to 20 reps there, and do that 1 to 2 days a week to start. Then you can progress to bands or dumbbells, kettlebells, machines, barbells as you want to go along, or you can jump right in. There's no rule saying that you have to wait, but I know for some people that accessibility feels a little bit more intimidating or more difficult. So meeting yourself where you're at, 1 to 2 days a week, just start there. I'd like to get you to at least a 2-day a week minimum, but it's okay if you need to start with 1. And then adding in at least go for a 20 to 30 minute walk every single day. If that's just where you need to start, that is okay. If your heart rate is getting to at least 50 to 60% of your heart rate max on a walk, it can count as cardio. And if you need to figure out how to find your heart rate max, just do 220 minus your age, and then divide that in half, or multiply it by 0.5 to 0.6. And that can give you a range of a minimum to at least target for. A little bit higher, 60 to 70% is potentially a little bit better, but that's okay. If you're at least getting to that place, then walking can count. being more active in general if you can. And then from there, maybe once you gain a baseline of cardio fitness or you start to feel more comfortable in the gym, you can maybe do 20 to 30 minutes of sustained cardio of some sort. Then we start adding in little tiny bits of sprint or HIIT interval training. Maybe it's just one day a week to start, and we're just starting with a few intervals so that you can get used to it and recover and it doesn't totally fry you, and then building up from there. So a week of training might just look like 2 full body days, lots of walking across the week, and 2 short and 1 longer cardio day across the week. So 5 total days of exercise across a 7-day period. You could even combine the cardio and the lifting, and that could be a great baseline place to start for just kind of easing into that. And then from there, you can progress, get more advanced, get more specific, depending on what it is that you want to do or where you want to take your fitness long term. And then for my more experienced athletes and trainees, just recognizing that sometimes maybe quality over quantity might be what you need, more recovery, supporting yourself with nutrition and sleep a little bit more specifically. And or, for everyone, working with your doctor or your medical team if you feel like you have more advanced or specific needs for the symptomology that you are struggling with. And then last but not least, giving yourself grace through this season. I'm not going to be 30 and function the way I do at 30 forever. And I know that, right? And it's going to suck for all of us, or it does suck to go through this phase in transition. And I do hope that science and research moves to a place where my generation or that behind me has more support than what a lot of people have now with information and accessibility of what they need to know. But right now, the best thing that you can do is give yourself grace and take care of your body in whatever way that looks, and recognizing that some weeks you might be crushing it and some weeks might be harder, and learning how to adjust with that ebb of flow of it's called auto-regulation and auto-regulating your training. So that way you're able to kind of ride those waves, and the days that you can give your most, make those the hard workout days, give those your most, and the days that you can't, well, maybe you're just going for a walk that day and you have to learn to be flexible, shifting and adjusting your weeks or your training sessions as needed in response to just how you're feeling as you're going through that phase in transition, and or just advocating for the help and support that you potentially need to support you during this phase in time with whomever you get your medical care with, or whatever that looks like for you. And so I hope this was helpful. Again, I'm on your side. Don't shoot the messenger. This is to help you potentially feel like you can take a little bit more grasp of what to do with your exercise training, and or feel more confident in wading through the misinformation out there, or just the massive amount of information out there for menopause specifically. And so if you found this helpful, please subscribe if you're on YouTube, subscribe if in your favorite podcast platform. If you can leave a review or a comment, I think I've seen a lot of podcasts do this, so I want to instill this rule. If you've listened to or watched 3 or more of my videos or my podcast episodes, if you can do me a favor to hit subscribe and either leave a comment here below or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. If you appreciate my content and for my information, doing that and then sharing with at least one other person, it will help me kind of spread my message. And the more you guys rate, review, like, subscribe, and share my information, the more I'm able to come back and give you more free, helpful, educational content here on my platforms as well. So thank you for tuning in. I hope this was helpful, and I will catch you guys on the next episode.